former president face this type of legal uncertainty. Mr. Trump's former chief of staff, Mark Meadows, now the latest member of the former president's inner circle to fold and cooperate with prosecutors who are charging Mr. Trump with trying to undermine the 2020 election.
Okay, so let me take you through what stands out as one of the most pointed and potentially damaging pieces of information to emerge from the federal election interference investigations surrounding former President Donald Trump. According to multiple credible news reports, Mark Meadows, who served as Trump's White House chief of staff, reportedly told federal prosecutors under a grant of immunity that by December 2020, Trump had privately acknowledged the election outcome in strikingly direct terms. The specific words attributed to Meadows describing Trump's private understanding were, "Obviously we didn't win. Obviously we didn't win." Those words, if accurately reported from Meadows' sworn testimony, represent a clear private recognition of the factual reality that Trump had lost the 2020 presidential election. At the same time, Trump continued to publicly promote a narrative that the election had been stolen, using the most high-profile presidential communication channels available to reach the broadest possible audience. It was not a hesitant suggestion like, "We probably didn't win," or "We might have lost." The reported private statement was unambiguous. Obviously, we didn't win. This combination, a direct private acknowledgement of loss paired with an aggressive, sustained public campaign asserting the opposite, has been described by legal analysts as particularly significant for the element of criminal intent in any potential election-related charges. Intent is often the most critical building block in serious federal cases involving false statements or efforts to interfere with the electoral process. When someone in a position of high trust and proximity to the president describes a gap between what was known privately and what was said publicly, it can directly challenge defenses that rely on claims of sincere belief or honest mistake. Meadows was not just any insider. As chief of staff, he functioned as the gatekeeper to the Oval Office. He managed access to Trump, coordinated sensitive meetings, reviewed key communications, and was present for many of the most important calls, texts, and discussions during the post-election period. His reported testimony came after he met with prosecutors multiple times, including before a grand jury, and it covered Trump's actions in detail. According to accounts from outlets like ABC News and CNN, Meadows indicated that he had repeatedly warned Trump that claims of massive voter fraud were not supported by evidence. He also reportedly characterized Trump's election night victory declaration as dishonest. And then came the December 2020 assessment attributed to Trump himself. The obvious recognition that the election had not been won. This timeline matters because by December 2020, several key developments had already occurred. The Electoral College had met and voted. Major news organizations had projected Joe Biden as the winner. Attorney General William Barr had publicly stated that the Department of Justice had found no evidence of widespread fraud sufficient to alter the outcome. Senior members of Trump's own campaign team had conveyed similar assessments. If Meadows' account is accurate, Trump had reached the same private conclusion by that point. Yet the public messaging continued unchanged, including pressure on state officials and the events leading up to January 6, 2021. Adding another layer is the testimony of Cassidy Hutchinson, a former aide who worked closely with Meadows. She reportedly told investigators that Meadows had shared with her that Trump had pretty much acknowledged the loss while still exploring ways to challenge or overturn the results. This creates independent corroboration from two people who both had direct access to the inner circle. One witness describing private knowledge is notable. Two witnesses aligning on the same core dynamic, private acceptance of the loss alongside continued public efforts to contest it, strengthens the evidentiary picture under standard prosecutorial standards that value multiple, independent sources. There's also a revealing contradiction in Meadows' own public writings. In his memoir, he repeated many of the fraud claims and suggested he had not fully settled on whether the election was stolen. Yet under oath with immunity, he reportedly described those same fraud allegations as baseless and stated that Trump understood the loss was obvious. The gap between the memoir's public-facing narrative and the sworn testimony was so pronounced that Meadows' own book publisher later sued him, citing the testimony as evidence that the book contained false claims. Being sued by your publisher for contradicting your own sworn statements is a rare and self-revealing development that underscores the tension between loyalty-driven public messaging and documented private understanding. Let's examine how this reported testimony might fit into broader legal theories. In the federal election interference investigation led by special counsel Jack Smith, prosecutors focused on whether there was a deliberate effort to overturn the election results despite knowledge that the claims lacked merit. Elements included false statements about fraud, pressure on state officials, the alternate elector scheme across multiple states, and coordination leading up to January 6th. Meadows' position as chief of staff placed him at the center of much of that coordination. Reports indicate he helped facilitate the January 2021 call-in which Trump urged Georgia Secretary of State Brad Raffensperger to find 11,180 votes, enough to flip the state's results. If Meadows warned Trump privately about the lack of evidence and yet participated in setting up that call while knowing Trump's private view, it could be seen as connecting high-level awareness directly to specific actions. This kind of evidence could help prosecutors build what some legal observers call a coordinated multi-state enterprise theory rather than a narrative of disorganized chaos or well-meaning confusion among loyalists. A chaotic mess defense suggests actions stemmed from panic, poor advice, or genuine but mistaken belief. But if the person running the White House operation repeatedly told the president the fraud claims were unsupported, and the president privately agreed the loss was obvious, then continued systematic pressure across states looks less like confusion and more like calculated direction from the top, with full awareness of the claim's weaknesses. Meadows' testimony, combined with call records, documents, and Hutchinson's account, creates a multi-source foundation that could make it harder to dismiss the efforts as mere political theater or sincere but flawed legal strategy. From a defense perspective, Trump's team has consistently framed such reports as part of a witch hunt and has pushed back against any suggestion of Meadows turning on him. Public statements have sometimes continued to describe Meadows as loyal even as the immunity deal and testimony details surfaced. This creates its own layer of public messaging that contrasts with the institutional reality of a former top aide providing detailed information to prosecutors under immunity. Prosecutors reportedly viewed Trump as the central figure in any potential conspiracy, with others as supporting players, which is why granting immunity to someone like Meadows could be strategically aimed at securing testimony against the main target. It's worth noting that immunity deals are not admissions of guilt by the witness. They are tools to obtain truthful testimony about higher-level conduct. Meadows received protection from prosecution based on his cooperation, and the content of what he said has been reported across multiple reputable sources. The core reported elements, repeated warnings about baseless fraud claims, the characterization of the election night statement as dishonest, and the December 2020 private acknowledgement form a pattern that legal analysts say goes to the heart of intent. If a defendant knew the claims were false, or at least knew they lacked evidentiary support, then repeating them in official contexts or using them to pressure officials can shift from protected political speech toward actionable false statements or conspiracy. The Georgia State RICO case also looms large here, as it charges a broader enterprise involving fake electors, pressure on officials, and the Raffensperger call. Meadows' reported role in helping set up that call, paired with his testimony about Trump's private knowledge at the time, could provide prosecutors in that case with direct operational and intent-related evidence. Even if federal cases faced procedural hurdles, including questions around presidential immunity, the underlying testimony and documents could remain available for other proceedings or future scenarios. Beyond the legal mechanics, this story highlights a deeper tension in how power and communication operate at the highest levels. A chief of staff's job is to filter information, manage the flow of advice, and help the president navigate complex realities. When that same person later describes under oath a clear private understanding of an election loss, while the public face remained one of total denial and aggressive contestation, it raises questions about the sustainability of maintaining two parallel realities, one for internal decision-making and one for external mobilization. The book publisher lawsuit adds a non-criminal but still formal layer of accountability. Publishers have commercial interests in the accuracy of the works they release. When sworn testimony directly undercuts the claims made in a memoir, it can trigger legal consequences independent of partisan politics. This isn't a political opponent filing suit, it's a business partner enforcing the basic expectation that published material aligns with what the author is willing to affirm under oath. Putting it all together, the reported Meadows testimony does several things at once. It provides a high-credibility insider account from the person with the most comprehensive access to Trump's post-election deliberations. It includes specific, repeated warnings that fraud claims lacked support. It attributes to Trump a direct private statement, recognizing the loss as obvious by December 2020. It aligns with independent testimony from Hutchinson about the same acknowledgement. It connects to documented actions like facilitating the Georgia call, and it stands in sharp contrast to both the public narrative sustained at the time and Meadows' own earlier memoir. This does not automatically prove any crime, as intent must still be weighed against the full context, including legal advice received, the intensity of partisan disputes, and the unprecedented nature of the challenges to election certification. Courts have high bars for proving criminal intent in politically charged cases, especially when First Amendment protections for political speech are involved. Defenses can argue that even strong private doubts do not equate to knowledge of falsity, or that continued challenges were legitimate exercises of seeking judicial or legislative remedies. The "obviously we didn't win" phrasing, while direct, could be interpreted in different ways depending on surrounding context, perhaps referring to immediate vote counts rather than final certified results, or reflecting frustration rather than final acceptance. Nevertheless, from a prosecutorial standpoint, the combination of private acknowledgement, repeated internal warnings, operational involvement in pressure efforts, and the sustained public campaign creates a narrative that is harder to dismiss as mere mistake or chaos. It shifts the evidentiary focus toward whether decisions were made with awareness that the foundational claims were unsupported. Multiple independent sources, testimony, call records, contemporaneous documents, and even the memoir contradiction reinforce each other rather than relying on a single witness. As developments continue, several things will be worth following. Any revival or continuation of federal election-related cases could test how this testimony is preserved or deployed. In Georgia, proceedings may reveal whether Meadows' account or his role in the Raffensperger call setup becomes part of trial evidence. Public reactions from Trump or his circle, especially any shifts in how Meadows is characterized, could signal internal evaluations of the testimony's impact, and the publisher lawsuit may produce additional public records that further document the public-private gap. In the end, the Meadows cooperation story, as reported, offers a detailed window into the inner workings of the post-2020 election period. It describes a chief of staff who claims he warned his boss about the lack of evidence for fraud claims, who facilitated key calls despite those warnings, and who later recounted under oath that the president had privately recognized the obvious outcome. Paired with corroboration and documentary contradictions, it constructs one of the more comprehensive insider accounts available in the entire election interference narrative. Whether this ultimately leads to accountability outcomes, shapes future legal strategies, or simply becomes another chapter in a deeply polarized historical record remains to be seen. The core reported element, the private "obviously we didn't win" acknowledgement alongside continued public assertions of a stolen election, sits at the center of debates about knowledge, intent, and the boundary between robust political advocacy and potentially unlawful conduct. It underscores how high-stakes power transitions test institutions, loyalty, and the consistency between private understanding and public action. Legal processes move deliberately, with multiple layers of review, evidentiary rules, and constitutional protections. Immunity testimony is powerful, but must be tested against other evidence and subjected to cross-examination in any actual trial. The public deserves clear, factual reporting without exaggeration, allowing individuals to weigh the reported details against the broader context of a contentious election and its aftermath. This account draws from documented reporting across major outlets and does not speculate beyond what has been attributed to Meadows and other witnesses. The "obviously we didn't win" statement, if confirmed in sworn testimony, stands as one of the most straightforward private assessments attributed to Trump during that period. How it fits into larger questions of intent, coordination, and accountability will continue to be examined in courtrooms, congressional settings, and public discourse for years to come. The tension between private knowledge and public narrative is not unique to this case, but the scale of the office involved and the stakes of a presidential election make it particularly consequential. Meadows' reported role as both warning voice and operational coordinator adds complexity. His decision to cooperate under immunity, the content of what he allegedly shared, and the resulting contradictions with his own book create a record that is difficult to ignore in any serious analysis of the events. As more details potentially emerge through trials, additional testimony, or declassified materials, the picture may sharpen or shift. For now, the reported Meadows testimony provides one of the most direct insider perspectives on the gap between what was understood behind closed doors and what was projected to the country. That gap, described as, "Obviously we didn't win in private while maintaining the strongest possible public challenge," remains a focal point for those examining the legal and historical dimensions of the 2020 election's aftermath. The story also reflects broader challenges in American politics: the difficulty of accepting loss in a high-stakes contest, the incentives for loyalty over candor, and the ways in which communication strategies can diverge from internal realities. Whether viewed through a legal lens of intent and evidence or a political lens of strategy and mobilization, the reported testimony invites careful consideration of how decisions were made when the most trusted advisors claimed to see one reality and the public was presented with another. In summary, the Meadows immunity cooperation, as detailed in reporting, centers on warnings about baseless claims, a characterization of dishonest public statements, and a private recognition of loss by December 2020. Corroborated in part by Hutchinson, connected to specific actions like the Georgia call, and contrasted with Meadows' memoir, it forms a multifaceted account from the heart of the administration. This does not resolve all questions but adds substantial, documented weight to analyses of knowledge and intent during that critical period. Observers across the spectrum will continue to debate its implications as accountability processes unfold.